This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to researcher Nathan Ruser about the ongoing conflict in Myanmar or Burma. 1 year ago today, there was a military coup, and ever since there have been very serious clashes which evolved into outright guerrilla warfare. There are dozens and dozens of resistance factions now, rebels fighting against the junta. Nathan's going to speak to us and tell us what's happening in Myanmar. If you like what we're doing, please support us for extra content at patreon.com/popularfront. So I think we'll get into the various different factions and the battles soon. But just to remind people, maybe you can just kind of briefly go into, what is it that happened in Myanmar, Burma, this new situation with the military junta. There's now many different militant factions fighting against them. Maybe just give us an idea of, what's been going on over the last year or so.
Yeah, so when you look at Myanmar's history more generally, you can see that there's a lot of streams of military dictators leading the country. And sort of in 2012 and then more so in 2015, it started opening up a bit. The sort of military started making some concessions to the civilian political parties, and they had, I think it's fair to say, overwhelming success at any elections that were given. So the military had sort of stacked the decks in a way where they'd guaranteed themselves a certain amount of seats. They'd guaranteed themselves enough sort of representation in parliament, no matter what happens, that they can veto whatever they want and they can sort of be in charge of whatever they actually want. But when it comes to the parts of parliament that were democratically elected, it was basically 90% plus going towards this National League for Democracy, which was Aung San Suu Kyi's party, that had sort of risen through the ranks through all of this student protests and all of these protests against military rule for the last 30, 40 years. But in November 2020, there was the most recent election where, again, the NLD won an overwhelming majority of seats. And so for the months between sort of November and February, the military was crying foul a lot. They were sort of trying to push this idea that the election had been rigged and that they had actually won more seats than the results showed. Of course, there was no evidence for this, but that was a line that they were pushing for months and months leading up to what turned out to be the coup. And I think very memorably, 2 days before the coup occurred, there was this, there was the headlines in all of the Myanmar news basically saying that the military refused to rule out a coup. And then 2 days later, first thing on February 1st, you saw the tanks rolling in through Naypyidaw, which is the capital, and you saw basically the whole country put under military rule for a couple of days while this coup took place. All of the democratically elected politicians got arrested, a lot of the activists got arrested, and a lot of just general civil society got detained as part of this coup. So for the first couple of days following the coup, there was this almost, I guess, shocked silence. Although it was sort of widely, people sort of had this idea that this could be coming. No one really knew how to respond to it originally. And then within a few days, the protests sort of started organizing, and the major cities started having quite large demonstrations against this military coup. And I think what's important to also note is that in those sort of 5 to 8 years where there was increasing democratization, it sort of gave this growing generation in Myanmar a taste of freedom that Myanmar hadn't really had before. So there were a lot more people now that were willing to resist and willing to protest. And then very quickly, I should mention that the Tatmadaw, which is the name for the military, and the State Administration Council, they had sort of envisioned some protests. So for the first couple of weeks, for the first little while where there were protests, it was all actually quite calm and quite peaceful. There were very large, peaceful protests in the city, but they weren't sort of being met with this mass repression and mass violence that we saw later. But I think that in a way gave a lot of the rest of the country that wasn't so much in these big cities the confidence to come out and protest as well. So within sort of 2 weeks of the coup, you had in basically the entire country protesting, not just the big cities, but the rural townships and even these tiny little hamlets. Whoever was basically there would come out with their NLD flags and march against the military. And that's sort of where the military's, I guess, tolerance for protests ended. And they launched these very large, very violent clearance operations, is what they called them. But in essence, hundreds of people were sort of being shot on the streets. And you had, in some memorable occasions, you had sort of troops basically surrounding protest camps, trapping them from exiting and then just opening fire. So you had this mass movement of opposition, organized peaceful opposition, that was then met with this mass violence all across the country. And you had people being killed you had protesters being killed in basically every city in Myanmar, from the largest ones to quite small towns. Whenever the police sort of encountered these protests, and a lot of these smaller towns do have police stations, generally the answer would be violence after the first few weeks of the coup. And so there was a bit of time where basically the Burmese community kept protesting quite peacefully, kept sort of trying to come out on the streets, and they sort of pushed for international intervention to sort of hold the military accountable for these massacres. And you saw this massive movement of responsibility to protect, and sort of saying that if the Burmese government does this to us, then we need the international community to step in. And as can sort of be expected, the international community didn't really do anything. There were a few sanctions on key leaders, and not even every country. So I'm from Australia, and Australia hasn't sanctioned anyone from Myanmar since the coup. And then it was sort of when the protesters and the organized resistance started realizing that they can't win on the streets, and they have to sort of physically stop the military's takeover. They have to sort of form quite, the start especially, it was very improvised armed oppositions. You sort of had you had like air guns, like pressurized air guns that shot marbles being used to defend protest camps in big cities. You had sort of sometimes hunting rifles being used, but that actually was a bit later. But yeah, it's sort of in March and April and May, there was this, I guess, countrywide almost realization that there needed to be something more than protests to stop these, to stop the military takeover. And then that's sort of how that coalesced into what turned out to be very widespread and sort of unprecedentedly large, organized armed resistance.
Right, yeah, I think it's a real textbook case of the people going, right, we are trying to do it peacefully. We are trying to say, look, you know, we don't want this. And then it got to the point where it's like, okay, well, now we actually have to engage violently. They did everything they tried to. And yeah, like you said, people were just getting mown down, like shot to bits, killed by the military in the streets. You're talking about people holding up flags, getting shot with semi-automatic rifles for nothing. You know what I mean? It wasn't even people throwing stones at the start, right? It was just like, right, people are just getting killed. I've seen some, you know, really quite brutal footage coming out of there.
Yeah, so once sort of the military started responding with these, with deadly force, you sort of did see this improvised sort of protest, defense where they had sort of very makeshift shields. You had, like, there's always those stories of people going to protest with a backpack full of school books and textbooks, as hoping that to be like an improvised sort of bulletproof vest.
Yeah.
And sort of there were like stones being thrown, and there were sort of the normal response to try to defend it, but there was widespread repression, sort of a death toll that reached over 1,000 people before there started being this, really organized and really countrywide armed resistance, I should say.
Yeah, and that has now turned from people going, right, we need to take, you know, guns out onto the streets, to really quite well organized militia movements. Now, we know that there have been various different ethnic militias for 80 years now. I think that they've been fighting the government, not just this military junta. But it's not just that, right? It's like normal mostly young men, just going out and joining various groups, forming their own paramilitary militia factions. We've got the People's Defense Forces now as a result of all of that. Explain to us what that is.
Yeah, so in the backdrop of all of what I was talking about previously, there are these decade-long, generally ethnic conflict that's been happening in Myanmar. So the oldest rebel group, the Karen National Liberation Army, formed about 18 months, 2 years after the country got independence. And so there has been this sort of constant perennial conflict in Myanmar that has sort of, in many ways, been relegated to the periphery. There was a communist uprising in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that sort of migrated from the center of Myanmar to the borders. But other than that, it had sort of been relegated to the border regions, and I guess the ethnic regions is what they're often considered as. And so there are a suite of sort of 10 to 15 ethnic armed actors that are quite formidable and in various states of conflict with the military. When the coup happened, it was actually quite a peaceful time. The Arakan Army, which was the largest and the most, I guess, dangerous armed group prior to the coup, immediately prior to the coup, had signed a ceasefire, and most of the large, formidable ethnic armed organizations had laid down their arms temporarily. But then this protest and the crackdown and this organized armed resistance came to the Burman sort of majority that lives in the lower regions of Myanmar, the lowlands, and this traditionally sort of peaceful area. So you sort of had each township in a way organizing its own defense. And you had, it's hard to sort of say who was the leaders of them, but you sort of had these organic township level sort of armed militias coming up where they sort of scrounged together homemade arms. Those pressurized air guns were very heavily featured in the early days. But in some of the sort of areas closer to those ethnic armed conflicts, there were sort of arms moving around. So, for example, in the west of the country, in Chin State, there were a lot of hunting rifles, tummy guns, they're called. And you sort of started seeing these. Actually, the most sort of notable account is in a city called Kalay, which is in a place sort of near the Chin Hills. And you started getting these armed protest guards sort of looking out after the protest huts with these little hunting rifles that had been used for decades, sort of 30 years, flintlock sort of stuff, where you can shoot a single bullet at a time, then you have to spend 4 or 5 minutes reloading, that had traditionally been used for hunting in the region. And then you sort of had other groups that had close connections to some of the ethnic armed organizations, and that sprung up largely from people fleeing the repression. They fled the repression to the areas controlled by these ethnic armies, especially the Kachin Independence Army and the Karen Liberation Army, the KNLA. And so there started to be sort of, especially urban youth sort of started doing training courses and started doing military training courses under the guise of these ethnic armed organizations. And so it took sort of a few weeks, a couple of months, but you sort of then started seeing these, very township level, quite local armed resistance groups forming. And they were very sort of ragtag, they were very unorganized, but then through the following months, they started sort of different groups started working together, forming basically what you see in Syria, where they sort of formed local, like within an umbrella of a few townships, defense rooms, and sort of started doing that, slowly coalescing towards a common cause. And in many cases, sort of reaching out to the government in exile, the National Unity Government, and sort of showing that they were on the same side as the National Unity Government, willing to listen to them and willing to sort of work together in a more organized way than just this township got together 200 people that were wanting to fight and managed to give most of them guns.
Right. I think this is such an interesting situation. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of examples, but I can't think directly right now. But it's not like you've got previously kind of ethnic militants swarming the city to fight the junta, taking advantage of the disruption. It's actually young men and women from completely normal, like suburban even towns in the capital, and then doing the opposite, going to the mountains, right, to be like, hey, we need help, we need you to train us. I just think that's such an interesting situation, how that kind of happens. Do we have any idea of like kind of numbers of people that have gone to join these groups?
So that sort of situation actually has almost a bit of a precedent in Myanmar previously. So
Okay.
that sort of communist insurgency that I was talking about sort of started again in a lot of these lowland areas. There was a very urban insurgency sort of not long after the country's independence. You sort of had communist rebels controlling large parts of Yangon and stuff like that. And eventually they got sort of pushed out and fled to the ethnic areas, the mountain areas, and sort of took refuge in them, and in some cases convinced some of those ethnic armies to join that communist cause. And that's actually what led to their demise in the end. A lot of factionalization between the different ethnic groups in the Communist Party. But numbers wise for the actual PDF now, it's really hard to tell because it's so grassroots. There's no sort of I doubt even the government in exile, the National Unity Government, would have a solid idea of the numbers. But you can sort of look at it in the number of groups active. So a commonly cited figure is about 50 active resistance groups, PDFs. I think it's actually a fair bit higher than that. I sort of see, in one township, you'll often have 6 or 7 different groups now that are quite active. So I think it's probably sort of pushing 100 now, maybe even a few more, a bit over 100 different sort of organized groups that are actually involved in armed resistance. And then you have a lot more groups that sort of have armed fighters but aren't necessarily fighting. They're more sort of focused on the provision of aid and stuff like that. But I think you could pretty safely say that there's between 50 and 100 different groups that have sprung up and that are quite engaged in fighting the Tatmadaw, the Burmese army. And yeah, it's really hard to put numbers on that. You sort of see different groups fielding different numbers. So, for example, the Karenni National Defense Organization, I think is its proper name. It has, I think, 13 different battalions that it uses across the state. And so you've got and they often fight together, but that sort of shows quite significant numbers in that group, and that group's actually been able to hold their own against pretty concerted Burmese military attacks.
The Karen kind of have held their region completely. I mean, if you're there, you're kind of, there's no military in their region. They kind of hold it, right?
Yeah, so I'm actually talking about the Karenni rather than the Karen.
Oh, so Jesus.
There's a huge number of different nationalities in Myanmar. So the Karenni is sort of the people that live in what's now called Kayah State.
Okay,
so that's a bit north of the general Karen region, and so that's the area, the cities of sort of Loikor and Damoso especially. There's been a couple of ethnic armed organizations that have been active there for decades, but they're mostly demilitarized. Some of them actually joined the Tatmadaw in the 2000s, which is a whole other cup of tea, having sort of some of the previous ethnic armed groups join the Tatmadaw in order to get economic incentives, basically. But yeah, so the Karenni sort of the Karenni people are different to the Karen people. And yeah, so the Karen people is that sort of long-standing insurgency since the 40s that has that does have a lot of basic control, but then there are also sort of always that idea of they have the general influence in the area, but the Tatmadaw, if they want to, can send sort of armed convoys through and they can't really do much about it, except for like sort of mine them and attack them sometimes, which has actually become a very prominent tactic throughout the whole armed resistance.
And where are the battles kind of taking place? It's not exactly, young men training up, forming the PDF, and then moving back into the city, right? Like a lot of these battles, from what I understand, are taking place in the hills, in the mountains, those kind of areas.
Yeah, so not so much the hills, but especially rural areas. So that's where they've been able to sort of do the most. I mean, I think generally when you look at it, where the conflict is at the moment, you can sort of summarize it in a few areas. There's the Chin Hills, which is the west. And so then you've got the Chin Land Defense Force, which is, again, a sort of umbrella organization of a bunch of these militias that basically has control of the entire rural areas. And the Tatmadaw can send convoys on roads between big cities, but can't really do much during that other than burn a few houses and kidnap a few locals. So I think there was one particular convoy that sort of came under such heavy attack that I think 80 different, the death toll among the Burmese military on that sort of 100-mile convoy was about 80 troops. And they were only able to move about 6 or 8 miles a day because they basically had to sweep every inch for mines and had to look out for ambushes and respond to these ambushes. So that's the group that started off with these hunting rifles, and now they've sort of upped their arms a fair bit, but they still sort of do their insurgent tactics in the mountains, sort of lay the ambushes, have a far superior knowledge of the terrain, the local area, and are able to use that to their advantage. Then you sort of have the lowland Sagaing region, which is has basically never had conflict before, not since the communists really. But that has sort of the Sagaing and the Magway region, which are pretty connected, has sort of exploded, especially with armed resistance groups in every township, sort of controlling most of the rural areas, controlling, in some cases, all of the cities, and actually having shadow governance in a lot of places. And so that's all sort of flatlands, that's all rural areas. There's no cover by terrain there. It's sort of just a function of the government not being able to get the manpower enough to sort of control the whole region. So they're sort of stuck in their garrisons doing convoys every few days that then get mined and targeted, especially mined in the lowland regions. And then you have widespread conflict among some of the ethnic areas. So Kachin, which is a region in North Myanmar, has been sort of on and off ceasefires for the last 20 years or so. And on and off sort of levels of conflict, but since the coup, conflict has picked up there again, and local PDF groups are allying closely with the established Kachin Independence Army to sort of work together there, and you actually see the Kachin Independence Army sort of moving into Sagaing and helping the PDFs there as well. And then the Karen region and the Karenni region, but it's basically a lot of Myanmar. And where there's not sort of this active armed resistance, there's a lot of sort of IEDs and bombs going off that target police, sometimes police convoys, sometimes police boxes, sometimes just government sort of infrastructure and government-owned things, such as there's a telephone network in Myanmar called Mytel, which is owned by the military, but it's a commercial telephone sort of network, like would all have like whatever service provider our phone uses. And so they've sort of had close to 500, I think, of their telephone towers blown up all across the country as part of this resistance. And so that's occurring where sort of there's not enough, or there's either too much of a troop presence or not enough critical support not enough critical numbers in the armed resistance to sort of send sort of companies of fighters across the landscape doing their war operations, but they're sort of limited to this more insurgent resistance. And that's largely what we're seeing in the big cities as well. Most days you'll see a couple of gun attacks on police positions or army positions in Yangon and in Mandalay. You'll see a lot of explosions targeting. I remember there was actually one quite memorable video a couple of months ago of it was basically a bunch of police mustering to do a morning drill, and you had resistance fighters standing on a street outside with 40mm grenades, just lobbing them into the crowd, and they killed, I think, about 20 or 30 police in that event. So there is still a lot of armed resistance in the cities, but it's sort of a different flavor.
Yeah, and there's some videos I've seen where the rebels, they're extremely competent. There's one I'm thinking of particularly where there's about, I don't know, a unit of about 30 of them in broad daylight walking through the streets, right up to the police station, and just boom, just open fire on the police station. And they're moving like, you know, they're trained well. You can tell that they've actually trained properly. Like, and these are not just former or like, you know, Karen rebels or whatever, like ethnic militias that have been fighting for years. You can tell these are young men, some of them as well, you know. So, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but it does seem like they're doing, you know, for want of a better word, they're doing quite well in terms of this resistance.
Yeah, so there's actually one attack in Yangon that really stands out to me. It happened last August, but basically the resistance groups, I think it was about 5 or so of them, boarded a train full of police officers,
Yes.
managed to shoot and kill basically all of them, seize their weapons, and then get off at the next stop. And so there is definitely some competence. There's always that learning curve for these new resistance fighters. A lot of the training they got was very quite quick and sort of not as in-depth as like you'd expect. It's sort of like 2 weeks training at most in the ethnic areas, and then a new sort of class came through. So they have made a lot of those sort of mistakes that everyone would make, such as it took them a while to diversify their sort of mine attacks. They used, I don't know the specifics, but they used quite a low power explosive to start with, and it took them quite a few months to sort of start using higher explosives in their mine attacks. And there's been also there's been always those teething issues, but they have been quite effective and quite efficient, especially considering where they came from and where they would have been this time a year ago. One of the Chinland Defense Forces, I remember, and this is a whole other issue, but I take these casualties with a bit of a grain of salt. But one of their snipers claimed to have killed about 100 Burmese soldiers in the sort of Chin Hills. And this time last year, he was a medical student in Mandalay. So there's been a really steep learning curve for a lot of these resistance groups that has been, I think, overall quite successful.
Right. One thing I've noticed as well is there's a kind of weapons disparity. So some groups you see pretty well armed, various kind of, you know, Chinese knockoff weapons. I think some have even had kind of black market US rifles. And then you'll see others where the whole militia, they build their own weapons out of like sheet metal. They build their own homemade grenades. They're very proficient at it, but it's quite rudimentary. And then, of course, we've seen quite a lot of images now of the 3D printed FGC-9 gun, the J-Starks gun. Why is it then that, you know, there is this disparity with the weapons depending on regions?
Yeah, so the biggest driver of that disparity is actually how close they are to those ethnic armed organizations, the groups that have the guns. And in some cases, the groups that can very proficiently make their own guns. So yeah, essentially, it's sort of the slow proliferation of those weapons out from these areas that have always had guns to the areas where this conflict is new. And you've sort of started to see that more even out. So even most resistance groups now have pretty basic sort of Vietnam era assault rifles, but a lot of them now have proper guns. But it's sort of this function of the fact that, especially early on, there were a lot more people willing to fight than there were guns and ammunition for those people. So the guns were sort of slowly flowing out of the areas, both the sort of being smuggled internationally over the Thai and India border, but also from the groups that have quite a lot of weapons and have well stockpiled weapons. And essentially the ones that they were going to first were grabbing them up first, and then it's sort of been trickling down like that. But that's actually one of the reasons why the Karenni fighters have been able to do so well, because right from the start they had quite good weaponry. They had quite extensive weaponry, and that was sort of a result of them having quite close relations with the Karen groups further south, but also a lot of the kind of defunct or kind of inactive armed groups that had been in that area in the 90s and the early 2000s had been quite effective in stockpiling their guns. So when the conflict broke out again and they had people sort of wanting to form these resistance groups and start resisting the military junta, they were able to sort of get the guns quite quickly. But you're sort of starting to see, more groups having more guns now. And I don't actually think I've seen that 3D printed gun used in sort of combat yet.
No, there's been no footage of that. I'm the reason they use the 3D guns. So there's a lot of people are like, "Well, what's the point?" It's like, well, if you're in a region where it's difficult to get the weapons, then and you have access, to some of these 3D printed guns, there's some speculation that they're built over the border and kind of trafficked in across the border for groups in areas that have less access to guns. So, having, even though it's a 9mm pistol, essentially, having that is better than not having a thing. And all it takes is one of them to jump into, like what you were talking about in August on the train. If you have one of them, you can kill, however many of your enemy like that. And there's also a thing recently that I saw where they found 3D printed guns kind of stashed in a bush. Now, my thoughts are maybe that's like a kind of go-to neighborhood, weapon for the militants. Like, right, if we need to do something quick in plain clothes, it's there. So it does make sense. But no, you're right. There's not been any footage of it actually being used in, an ambush or anything, because I don't know, it wouldn't really make that much sense. But, it does show that there is a lack of weapons for certain people there. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother building it.
Yeah, and it's certainly better than sort of the high pressure air guns that were being used early.
Yeah.
I think that's actually, though, an interesting thing to talk about, sort of almost the defense industry that sprung up within these resistance groups.
Yeah, it's incredible.
So it initially started with these guns and you sort of had gun factories popping up out of nowhere, but really it's become like this quite ingenious and very, very quickly escalated thing. So right now, since a lot of these groups have started to get basic assault rifles, not great, but better than what they can build themselves, a lot of this defense industry has shifted to giving these groups new sort of strategic capabilities, sort of indirect fire, mortars, and even explosives, and actually memorably, and it's sort of it has been proliferating quite extensively this month, bomblets that can be dropped from drones. And so you're sort of starting to see most groups, or a lot of groups, now have homemade mortars, homemade mortar launchers, and are able to do sort of quite not necessarily as effective as a professional mortar team, but at least intimidating indirect fire within a couple of kilometers of their position, which is something that sort of they haven't been able to do before. And a lot of that sort of ingenuity and experience has come from sort of the wide swath of people that were willing to join this resistance. So some of it has come from people that have defected from Burmese defense industries, and they form a large part of sort of how they guide that defense industry. But a lot of it is also just from engineering students and people at university and mechanics and stuff that have sort of been able to translate their vocational skills into this defense industry now. I remember seeing one video that was showing sort of this group that was sort of hiding out in the bush, and they'd managed to turn a waterfall stream into a phone charger.
That's incredible.
They're just using like the hydropower from the waterfall. So it has been this quite ingenious almost escalation of that defense industry from what started off as like quite rudimentary guns to quite strategic weapons, or at least relatively strategic, and also a lot of ammo. Some of the biggest issues now is getting ammo to these fighters.
Really, there's a shortage of that, is there?
Yeah, so you'll often see it like that was in Karenni State in Kaya. Basically, the resistance groups took the state's second largest city, Demoso, and were sort of pushing into the capital city, Loikor, had taken sort of large parts of the south of that town, sort of, and doing quite daring raids into the rest of it, but then have sort of had to temper back that offensive because they're running short in ammo. And you saw that especially sort of early on in sort of April, May, June. You'd see one sort of part of the country flare up very violently, have a lot of results in resisting the military, and then sort of quiet down once they ran out of ammo and somewhere else would pick up.
Right. Now that there's all these different people joining these ethnic militias, I hate to say ethnic militia, but you know what I mean, just these different factions. I guess there's not really any issues then with them and the whole, the reason that these militias were fighting in the first place. Like, have they kind of just said, right, we'll take any of you, if you want to fight the government, or is it, lads go into their kind of specific background, if you like, for militias?
Yeah, so the whole ethnic issue in Myanmar has always been it's been one of the more sort of effective parts of the military propaganda over the past few decades. There was this idea that all of these ethnic armed groups were what was spoiling Myanmar's prosperity, what was preventing it from becoming one country. And there was this idea that it was the ethnic rebels that were at fault, not the military. And so the coup has largely challenged that. So it has sort of taught a lot of the younger generation, especially, to empathize with these ethnic armies and to sort of understand that they have been fighting the Tatmadaw for decades now, and now the sort of now the sort of majority Burman population is only just starting to see this brutality sort of targeting them. So it's brought a lot of solidarity, and you've sort of seen this push towards genuine federalism and federalization in a way that sort of a lot of basically was very fringe and very not accepted in Burmese politics previously. But there is still a long way to go. And because the NLD, which is the National League for Democracy, the government before the coup, they'd spent that 5 sort of to 8 years of increasing democratization, still marginalizing these ethnic groups and still sort of denying them a lot of the political representation that they wanted and keeping them politically and economically and socially marginalized. And they played a pretty solid part in that. So because even though the conversation has shifted, a lot of the sort of pedigree of the National League for Democracy into the new National Unity Government, the sort of new government in exile, there's a lot of apprehension in the ethnic groups about partnering them, and there's still a lot of distrust. And to the NUG's credit, it's sort of been quite successful in forming these committees, these very important guiding committees that incorporate a lot of these ethnic voices and sort of seem to be doing everything right in saying that we do sort of recognize the errors of our ways before, and we want to have a much more inclusive parliament going forward. We want to go into this federalism, but there still is a fair bit of distrust there.
Yeah, I can imagine. Although I would say I doubt that, there's many, I don't think they would distrust just, young men coming from the city being like, help, right? I guess it's on a bigger scale.
Yeah, and for sure, when sort of you had those activists fleeing originally, pretty much not every, but most of the ethnic groups were happy to sort of say, hey, take shelter now. The areas we have under our control, we'll train you up. We'll do all of this. So yeah, I guess it's more of a distrust at a systematic level. And a worry that the government in exile will accept concessions that make the future political scene still not what the ethnic armies want. But yeah, from the ground, you have seen quite close coordination between some of these ethnic armed groups, especially the KIA and the KNLA, and PDF groups that operate in that general area. And it's something that I don't know much about the details that I'm fascinated by, but you've got the Kachin Independence Army in some large townships in northern Myanmar, and then you have a parallel People's PDF group, People's Defence Force militia that's active there, and they're very closely coordinated, and I think they sort of they always fight together, and I think they fight under the same sort of command, but there's like the notional difference between the PDF and the KIA, and it's quite interesting to see.
Definitely. The irony is that the brutality of the military junta has actually coalesced people to come together and then say, right, let's forget these ethnic differences. Let's fight, the powers that be that are standing on our head. I think that's kind of ironic that it happened that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and for decades, the Burmese military has sort of pursued this four-cut strategy, which is a really sort of brutal and oppressive strategy that's always attempted to sort of cut these ethnic armies away from people, food, support, and money. Or I can't remember if that's exactly what those four cuts represent, but basically cut them off from support and supplies. And so that's required sort of the forced relocations of hundreds of villages, sort of at gunpoint, the pretty brutal siege tactics in ethnic areas, and that's sort of what, in many reasons, that's why these ethnic armed groups have been so enduring and haven't been able to be defeated, because they sort of the military shows its brutality at every point, and now those tactics are being used on the Burman people that sort of have been this large polity before, that were exempt from some of the worst, I guess, violence by the military. And so now you're sort of starting to see all of these people realize the true human cost of a lot of these military moves. And also, the military doesn't really have enough manpower to actively cut these resistant groups off from people, supplies, and everything. So it's sort of using this antiquated and quite violent strategy in a way that doesn't really work. And that's what a lot of sort of the defected soldiers have said, that what a lot of the difference is that the Tatmadaw can't really adapt. It knows its way of fighting, and it knows how to fight in that way. But the threat that it's facing now through these widespread armed resistance is different to anything it's faced before.
Right. And whilst we're on this kind of ethnic topic, maybe just explain briefly, why is it Myanmar/Burma? Where did all this kind of erupt from?
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of think a lot of people sort of put more weight into this than it needs. But Burmese, so it's traditionally been Burma. Since independence, it was called Burma. But sort of Burmese has a casual form and a formal form. So the language is different if you're speaking casually versus if you're speaking formally. And so the casual way to say it is Burma, and the sort of formal way of saying it is Myanmar. And so in the 80s, shortly after, I can't remember the exact date, but I think it was shortly after, there was another sort of student protest movement that was brutally put down, and a sort of new military junta came in, a new military dictator came in. One of their things was, we're going to change the name from Burma, the casual form, to Myanmar, the formal form, which doesn't really have huge ramifications. And Burmese people will call it both in different circumstances. I generally call it both in whatever sounds better in the sentence.
Yeah.
But I think it was sort of seen as this not accepting this decision to change the name is a way of delegitimizing a government that people don't think is legitimate that made that change. I think a lot of the more substantive sort of name changes that have happened have been the ones that have actually affected ethnic areas. So the Karen region is now called Kayin in all the official maps. The Karenni region is now called Kaya in all these official maps, in sort of this way to kind of separate the nomenclature of the country away from, and take that power away from the ethnic groups.
Right. We've spoken a lot about the Tatmadaw. I should have probably asked this sooner, but maybe can you explain what they are?
So the Tatmadaw is just the name for the military. So just in Burmese, the military is called the Tatmadaw. So they sort of fulfill the normal duties of a military, but they also then there is the more complicated aspects where they do have the sort of police militias. They have the border guard force, right, which are former ethnic militias that have now joined the Tatmadaw. Then you have sort of other pro-government militias. You have the sort of informant civilian militias. You have the military's political party militia. There's all sorts of stuff. But the Tatmadaw itself is just the name for the military.
They're unbelievably brutal as well, right? I saw someone sent me it without saying a thing, and I was like, right, thanks for that. But basically, this horrific video where they caught some rebels, and you know, I have to say it because it's what they did. They'd cut off this guy's limbs from the knee and the elbow, and he was just sat there, and they're just filming him bleeding out, and they're just laughing at him. Like, there's another example where I think they went into a village recently and just burnt everybody alive. Like, this is a really fucking brutal junta, right?
Yeah, and in many ways, the Tatmadaw sort of lives a parallel life to normal Burmese citizens. They sort of have their military encampments, their bases that in some cases are like bigger than the villages that they're next to, but they don't really leave that. They sort of have their own military schools, military hospitals, and it's this massive indoctrination process bring people to be this brutal. And so you sort of have this widespread culture of brutality. And I mean, you've seen it basically every day since the coup. You've seen some sort of horrific violent attack by the military that you think, how can a sort of how can a person do this? That comes from these sort of decades of indoctrination and this total separation from the reality and this total separation from the rest of the country.
Right. And what have they said kind of politically? What is their stance right now? I know obviously they've taken over the country, but are they kind of saying, oh, it's in a transition, or that's it now? It's like, we're here, we're the dictatorship. What? Or are they kind of being more tactful than that?
It's a bit of both. When they took over, they said, yep, we're the transition government, we're the caretaker government, we're going to have elections in a year. That's now been pushed for 2 years. It was then pushed to 3 years. Like there's no sort of...
Right.
And they've also sort of very openly talked about outlawing the other political parties other than the military-affiliated USDP party. So, yeah, there is sort of this nominal sense of we realise that we should say that we're a caretaker government, but there's really no sort of ceiling on that, and there's an understanding in Myanmar that means nothing, that lip service. So that is sort of, we're here for good now. And you've seen previously sort of when military dictators have taken hold, they've stayed for decades.
And so it's not over the top to say that this is an out and out totalitarian dictatorship now.
Yeah, so there's one of the I think an anecdote that sort of tells that quite well is there's a new law that they're sort of drafting that will ban VPNs from someone's phone, or from just ban VPNs.
Yeah.
And basically sort of let people access all the websites that have been blocked. And so I heard a story, and I don't know if it is true, so I should say that. But I heard an anecdote, sort of, there were 3 people that were stopped at a military checkpoint. One of them was fined because they had a VPN on their phone. The other one didn't have a VPN on their phone, and they were fined because they'd clearly just removed it from their phone, according to the military. So they'd said, oh, you don't have it on your phone, but you must have just taken it off, so we'll fine you anyway. The third didn't have their phone, and they got fined as well because there was this idea that, well, if you didn't have your phone, it means you have a VPN at home, and that's why you didn't bring it out, so we're going to fine you as well. So it's very much this, and this is all from a draft law that still hasn't been put into effect yet. So there is this totalitarian sort of rule that doesn't really follow the rule of law, and is in many ways sort of a cover for a lot of the sort of Tatmadaw on the ground to do their own sort of extortion in many ways.
Who's the leader of this? Is there one specific leader right now?
Yeah, so there's the person that led the coup, Min Aung Hlaing.
Yeah.
I don't know if I said that right.
Yeah, I think so.
But Min Aung Hlaing is the sort of person that is the head of the Tatmadaw that did it. But there's this whole SAC, I think it's State Authority Council or State something council, that sort of nominally rules, but it is very much sort of a one-man dictatorship at the moment, backed by him and sort of the people that enable him.
And what's he saying? Is he like out there talking, or is he kind of this shadowy figure still?
He's out there talking a bit, but it's very sort of, it's not very useful things that he says. It's sort of, he'll put a speech in the state-run papers that sort of talk about the legitimacy of his laws, sort of his law talk about the perceived rigging of the 2020 election, and all of this sort of stuff. But he's not like, I guess he's just sort of taking up normal political duties in the extent that they can with this resistance. And I think that's actually an interesting thing to note, sort of how much this resistance has been able to get in the way of normal governance. So even the sort of higher up, I remember a couple of months ago, there was the state tourism minister was trying to tour a beach in the country, and in a part of the country that has sort of not really seen much violence, one of the safer areas. And his convoy got targeted with mines a couple of times driving back from there. So there's very much this idea that I think especially in the upper echelons, but also generally throughout the military, there's danger in leaving these sort of sanitized, controlled areas.
Right, that's interesting. And what's the response from the people? Are there people that like really support the junta, or is everybody kind of just having to live under it?
So I think it's pretty fair to say that the opposition is pretty universal. When you look at sort of the election results, it's genuinely stuff like high 80% of people voted for the NLD, the not military party, and most of the other 12-15% were people voting for various ethnic parties that are, again, not the military. So I think it's fair to say that there isn't much grassroots support, but there is sort of this network of often military families, often sort of affiliated with the old administration system for that democratization, and families like that sort of are quite pro-military. And in fact, that's actually the basis of one of the most important pro-government militias, the Pusorhati. And that's basically a civilian militia that's sort of been armed since the coup and is sort of the central part of the government's intelligence gathering facility, because they have these members in most towns. And then there is also sort of some townships, like particularly linked to certain industry that's very government run, or particularly linked to sort of large military installations within the area that are quite pro-government. But overall, I think it's fair to say that there's almost, it's quite universal, the opposition, the military there. And I think that's what the military itself didn't really foresee, the scale of this opposition, because they sort of, as I've sort of said before, they're living in this sort of isolated, quarantined part of the world of Myanmar, where they don't really have much connection and opportunities to mingle with the rest of the population. And they'd sort of talk themselves up into thinking that they had a lot more genuine support than they did.
What's the situation with the former leader? Obviously, they overthrew her. She was under house arrest for a bit. Where is she now?
Yeah, so I think she's still under house arrest. She's been sentenced to, I think, 8 or 12 years in prison at the moment. But I think I have to say I don't particularly care for her that much. No. I'm not totally across what her current situation is. But I think she's detained in home detention, which is how she lived most of her life. And she's being sort of very much tried for pretty mock trials, and sort of being given 4-year sentences a pop. I think one of them is because she had walkie-talkies that she wasn't meant to or something, and she got 4. I think she's getting 4 years for that. But yeah, so she's sort of currently detained. But I think the government's decided that it's not wise to make an example of her. And in sort of how the same way that the government for 30 years before the democratization kept her under house arrest, but knew that they couldn't really hurt her because she does have this so much adoration within the country.
Well, yeah, let's talk about her briefly, because obviously the junta is very bad, but she was no angel. I know she won the fucking Nobel Peace Prize, which is useless anyway, but she's been bad, right? She was in charge when the Rohingya were massacred, right?
Yes, she was. When that genocidal violence happened, and I think the UN Peace Prize needs to look at how many of their recipients have gone on to commit genocide.
Yeah, I'd say.
But I think she has always sort of lived, and this might be unpopular to say to a lot of Burmese people that are listening, but my perception is that she's always lived with the idea that the best way forward is to compromise with the military. and to sort of form this common understanding where they can come to this sort of power sharing agreement similar to that sort of semi-democratized status that Burma had from 2015 onwards. And so her father was actually Aung San, who was one of the major sort of independence leaders at the dawn of the country, or the dawn of independence. And he fought with the Japanese and then the English in World War II and sort of launched the country's independence in many ways. And so I think you can sort of see that she has always been within these military circles. Even though he got assassinated by the military, he was sort of adjacent to it. And she's always had this idea of, I guess, reform rather than overthrow, and sort of this idea of compromise with the military, which is sort of in many ways what led to that massive violence against ethnic groups during her law. She was like, well, this is what the military has control of. They're very passionate about it. I don't want to get in the way of that. And is another reason why there was sort of so much failures during her term in terms of reconciliation and agreements with the ethnic groups, because she was too much on the military side for there to be any sort of long-term agreement that took place under her.
Okay, what's the situation then internationally? I know you said at the start there that, I mean, it seems to me as well from what I've noted, no one really cares. But Myanmar does have links to various different countries across the world. What is the situation there? Like geopolitically, how are they sitting now with the junta in control?
So it's been pretty quiet. The international community hasn't really done much in order to sort of hold the junta accountable for anything. I think in terms of the biggest sort of the best thing they've done, especially for the resistance community, is to not really accept the junta. They don't really recognize it, and very few countries recognize it. I think when Burma celebrated its Independence Day, something like 5 countries, all of which sell arms to Myanmar. Only I think 5 countries sort of sent congratulations, and there's basically, in the international community, even among ASEAN, which has always been extremely don't rock the boat, let countries do what they want, we only exist by consensus. Even they haven't really recognized the SAC as the government of Myanmar. And so I think that's been quite effective. Sort of China has quite close links with Myanmar. Myanmar is basically its avenue to the Indian Ocean. There's major economic programs sort of trying to get Chinese goods to ports in Myanmar to then send them out through the Indian Ocean. And so that sort of has continued through the coup in many ways. And especially early on, China copped a lot of opposition within Myanmar for this stance, where sort of some Chinese factories got burnt during the protests. And there was this idea that China is on the side of the military. And that largely seems to be playing out, but I'd say China is more on the side that they think is going to win, rather than one side in particular. They want to have good relations with whoever controls the country in 5 years. And so originally that was the military. They sort of decision makers in China aren't really great at conceiving a popular uprising. And so they sort of automatically sided with the military. But I think in the years since, they've sort of started to see that maybe the popular opposition won't win, but they're certainly going to have a long-standing influence in Myanmar, and have sort of started dealing with the government in exile more directly. So, for example, I think they recently contacted the National Unity Government directly and said, hey, can you ask all the armed groups to not attack our pipelines going through Myanmar? And China also has quite close relations with a couple of the long-established, but not active in combat ethnic armies that sort of have their own statelet within Myanmar. The most important of which is the UWSA, the United Wa State Army, which itself is an offshoot of the Communist Party before. India itself is also quite interesting. It's always been, I guess, almost neutral in that they issued a lot of Burmese refugees have gone to India and have sort of been welcomed there, but they're also sort of starting to do some level of normalization with the Burmese military. They're sort of they're sort of starting those motions of recognizing the Burmese military.
Similar in Thailand as well, right?
Yeah, so Thailand's another complicated thing where there was a military coup in 2014, which sort of still holds power. And so I think Prayut Ocha in Thailand isn't necessarily keen in setting this example of people overthrowing a military junta. But there is always a lot of sort of, I think you could call it solidarity between the people of Thailand and Myanmar. And in many ways, I think that extends to large factions of the military and large factions of the government. So they don't really formally recognize the SAC, and there's a bit of a nuanced situation there. But one thing I should also say about India now, is that I think we've sort of started to see in the last few months the Burmese military sort of offering safe haven and even partnering with rebel groups in the Indian northeast, in sort of Naga, in Manipur, in Assam sort of region, and sort of offering them safe haven in exchange for helping them become a militia against the armed resistance groups there. And so that has the potential to sort of upset a lot of these changing dynamics in India as when it comes to recognition of the junta. And it's actually, I think it was in 2015, actually, the Indian army sent this sort of quite daring commando raid into Burmese territory to attack a Indian rebel group that was headquartered in Myanmar. And so there has always been that tension along the border. And I think in recent sort of months, you've seen the Burmese military, I think almost out of desperation more than anything else, sort of try and partner again with these Indian rebel groups to sort of to sort of oppose the armed resistance in Myanmar.
It's a very complicated situation, man. Like every facet of it has, different routes here, there, and everywhere. It's really complicated. But I think we've covered most of that. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I think maybe one thing that would be interesting to talk about is the role that the success that the armed resistance group has had in the armed resistance groups and the PDF have had in dismantling the state organization within the rural areas, especially. So you've had and it's not always the prettiest thing, and in many cases it has sort of resulted in abuses of their own. But the PDFs and the armed opposition have sort of gone on this very large assassination spree of key sort of government leaders, key military informants, and key sort of facilitators of the military's rule in a lot of these urban townships. So, for example, I was talking about the Pusorti militia earlier, which is the one that sort of brings a lot of this intelligence and this local knowledge to the military and enables them to use that against the armed resistance groups. Pretty much every day, a solid number of those militia members are being assassinated, are being killed, and it's sort of very rapidly dismantling that sort of grassroots intelligence and grassroots government that the military has. And so you've also seen that you've also seen that sort of used against local government administrators that in many cases have always been cozy with the government. And so that sort of combination of assassinations and broad threats of violence have basically made the entire administration structure resign in quite a lot of townships. The local PDF group will go village administrators, ward administrators, township administrators, village tract administrators in this township. You have until this date to resign, or else we'll start considering you a target. And whenever that happens, like a solid majority of the military's governance in the region resigns and moves elsewhere. It has been remarkably, I guess, successful at achieving their aims. And because of that, they've sort of been able to establish their own shadow administration in a lot of areas. So in the Chin area, one of the townships is called Mindat, and something like 3/4, I think it is, of the villages there now have a school run by the armed opposition groups and their affiliated sort of governments, like the National Unity Government-led curriculum. And you sort of have shadow sort of civil administrations coming up in a lot of these areas as well, because the armed resistance groups have made it impossible for the military's administration to operate there. And I think that's sort of one of the more surprising and I think very strategically important things that this armed resistance group has been doing. And you've even had townships of Yangon, where basically every local administrator has resigned after these threats of violence. And now it's sort of hard to suggest how much relevance they have on the ground, but there is in many cases a lot of this shadow administration that happens in the rural areas and that sort of nominally exists in areas that the government doesn't control anymore.
So it's definitely, it's hard to gauge where this is all going. Do you know what I mean? It's like, okay, they're very effective and they're extremely well organized, but the military does have extreme power as well, and not just in terms of holding politics, but in terms of militancy, weapons, that sort of thing. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think this is just going to go on and on and on like the previous civil wars, or do you think, I don't know, do you think they have a chance, the rebels?
I think it's hard to sort of, this year is going to be the important year, I think, in sort of setting the tone for everything more generally. So I think sort of what it relies on is this critical mass of attrition and defection within the Burmese military to make this hold by force, this hold by iron fist, sort of impossible to maintain. And you've sort of had some success in defections. By all accounts, the morale within the military is sort of record low. They're sort of being forced to, they're not being told they're not being told their mission, they're being told to go into this town, and then their commanders are being told to burn it. They're sort of not able to move around the country without mines going off all the time. They're sort of struggling in a lot of places to get food and to get supplies. So they're going hungry. The military is, because they sort of, it takes, especially like in areas where there is a sort of more established opposition control, like Chin or Cayenne regions. It takes a military convoy, like the military convoy is moving at about 6-8 miles a day, not very far.
No.
And so basically in a lot of these areas, all the resupply is having to happen by helicopter. And so that's really making them ration it and sort of affecting the morale in a lot of ways. But so far, there hasn't really been any major defections. There hasn't been sort of whole units defecting. It's sort of been a soldier getting away while they can run away in a place where they can run away and then joining the opposition, or just demobilizing and de-arming and going back to civilian life. So that would be a thing that could potentially change this strategically, change the center of gravity, and sort of make success by the opposition seem a lot more likely. And actually just today it emerged that there was a defection of 11 people at once, which I don't think I've ever seen before. And of course, that's not whole huge numbers like battalions, brigades worth.
It's relevant.
It's showing, it's the first sort of occasion I've seen a small unit defecting sort of in a sort of relatively large number. Another thing is the attrition, I think, is really sort of starting to hit the Burmese military. So you sort of have leaked documents from even as early as April in the year showing that across this division, on average, each battalion, which should have about 250, 300 people, actually had about 80 people that could do fighting. And you've sort of had reports of entire battalions being destroyed these are often by the ethnic armed groups rather than the civil resistance forces. But it's you sort of see that there's a couple of hundred light infantry battalions across Myanmar. If each one of them has 80 people, it's certainly a lot less of a formidable force than a lot of people are imagining. And sort of every day, opposition are reporting between sort of 50, 60, 100 military people killed every day. So there is this real strong hit of attrition from the military, which I think they're struggling to recoup from. So sort of in my mind, they're going to sort of have to give up control a lot of the more rural regions quite soon. I think they have limited control over them already. Sort of there was a leaked speech that came out of a sort of a provincial level army officer saying that about saying that about 6 of the townships in that province, which is quite a small province, were completely out of the hands of the military, of the civil, like the military administration. And you're sort of seeing similar things happening in a lot of the rural areas across Sagaing, across Kayin, across Kachin, across Chin, and across Kaya region. But the upshot of that is I suspect they're going to start relying a lot more on air power. It's going to sort of start to be this shift towards just airstriking the areas because they know they can't sort of have this freedom of movement for the military ground forces. And so I think that's going to have a lot of deleterious effects on the civilian population, as we've seen in Syria. It's kind of a very similar thing to what we saw in Syria, where the government had to pull back from a lot of the rural regions, sort of ceded that to opposition control, and then used airstrikes to basically foment terror and make life impossible in areas under opposition control. And that's what I sort of worry is going to happen. And I don't really see in the short term anyway, opposition becoming established in many of the major cities. That could always happen, but it would require sort of widespread defection or demobilization of the military within those cities, and we haven't seen any signs of that yet. But again, traditionally, the last 3 or 4 months is when the Burmese military does most of its fighting for the year. It's sort of the fighting season when the roads are wet enough to allow them to sort of do maneuvering, do operations, and in that time they launched sort of several operations that were designed to snub out the resistance in those areas. There was one in Chin State, there was one in northern Sagaing, and all of those were abject failures, where sort of a lot more, there were hundreds of military casualties during those operations and very few sort of casualties among the armed resistance. So who knows what the next sort of, the period when traditionally the military can't do much outside of their bases, which is sort of traditionally what's happened in the fighting with the ethnic armed groups in the wet season, and in sort of April to sort of August, there's very little movement that the military can do. So this was an important time for the military the last few months has been an important time for the military to sort of establish control and become the major actor in these areas again, and they haven't been able to do that. So it's a bit up in the air what the next 6 months is going to bring, but I think it's probably going to sort of lead to this position where the armed opposition is has a lot more significant control and probably has a lot more sort of grassroots administration popping up, but can't wrest control of a lot of the larger cities out of the military's hands.
Yeah, totally. There's also been, in my opinion, it's evidence that the military are losing grip in rural areas where they started just burning villages down. Now, I know some people might say, oh, well, that means that, they got close enough to do it. But that's not what you do if you're in control. You don't go in and just burn down a village. To me, that screams, struggle. They're struggling. You know what I'm saying?
So that's sort of that continuation of the four-cut strategy. They go, this village supports the opposition. Therefore, we're going to deny this village sort of food, housing, shelter, supplies, manpower, access to things, and we're just going to burn it. And so that's sort of a continuation of what they've done for the last 30 years. I don't necessarily think it shows weakness in and of itself, because that's sort of what their tactic is.
Right, just to destroy the resources then.
Strength. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it's very sort of telling that the military can only operate through these regions by sending out a quite large convoy. When you see the videos of the convoy going past in these sort of lowland areas where there is the burning, they're going at like 80 miles an hour as fast as they can, trying to avoid all the mines. And they sort of don't have the operational reach and maneuvering to do anything other than visit this town, maybe set up base there in the high school there for a few days, make everyone flee and burn a bunch of houses, and that's pretty much all that they're able to do. And so that's what they are doing.
Okay, mate, that was really, really helpful. Thank you very much. If people want to see more of your work on this, I think you're doing great work, by the way. If people want to see what you're doing, how can they do that? How can they contact you?
Yeah, so I put most of what I do goes on Twitter eventually. So that's at NRG8000. And I'm also doing some work with a group called Myanmar Witness, which sort of looks to verify a lot of the footage coming out and sort of, basically just verify what's happening there. And they do really good in-depth investigations into certain atrocities and certain things. So if you're interested, definitely check out what Myanmar Witness is doing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, mate. Appreciate that.
No worries. Thank you.
That was researcher Nathan Ruser speaking to us about the developments over the last year in Myanmar or Burma regarding the resistance to the military junta in the country and the many war crimes and attacks that have been carried out. Definitely check out his work. He's very good. I'm a big fan. He's doing great stuff. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/popularfront. We do not accept corporate investment and we don't have advertising from any shady fuckers. So the way we make money is the Patreon. We're also completely demonetized off of YouTube because YouTube says no, can't advertise on that because, you know, you're showing war, the realities of war, and YouTube only allows either big corporate media to advertise or ridiculous bullshit. So there you go. Yeah, if you can support us, that is really appreciated. You get a lot of extra content. Patreon.com/popularfront. This episode was sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee shop, coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue, 97239. The episode was also sponsored by Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA. One in South, one in West. Find them on socials at Grindcore House. The episode was also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use the promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. Also check out the Popular Front section there. We have some posters there that are specifically Popular Front stuff, you know, things photos we've taken in the field, stuff from our documentaries. The JSTAT poster is there, all sorts. Propagandopolis.com. Follow us on social media, Instagram at popular.front, or if that goes down, the backup is at popularfront_. Same as our Twitter. On Twitter, it's at popularfront_. If you want to follow me on anything, it's at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. You can check out my work with various different outlets at jakehanrahan.com. Oh yeah, also the youtube.com/popularfront. Definitely check out our documentaries. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black and Tiago Deason. Check out samblackpf.com and Instagram at THIAGODEZAN. Yeah, thank you to our high tier Patreons. They are username NTHG845829. If you can change your username, that'd be much easier, but no worries if not. Tom Taylor, Ethan Zwick, Champagne Anarchist, Thwat, Elise Middlefar, Lewis, David McManus, Joaquin Williamson Holt, Udoye Travis, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Kate, Lisa Milgram, Bradley Davies, Brendan Crave, Pete Hesher, RX, Aid Nicole, Travis Lieberman, Cherry, Ben Marshall, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, MJ, K Glitter Vulcan, Meredith Waters, Bethany Swoveland, Adam H, Karante, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamond Steen, Michael O'Connor, Zach Picard, Todd Cravens, Nicholas Butter, JD, Jav, Ian Froese, James Cully, Tynan Daly, Ethan, Shanklin the Painter, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, Mike Barone, Liam Williams, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Giorgio Arani, DR, Trey Nance, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Nawaiz, Nate Van Dor, Christina Ravetti, Freya Northman, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, JL, Stephen Davila, Anthony Kobarak, Dan Dunham, Fletcher, Diana Gourvanek, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zumbul. Thank you all very much. Really do appreciate it. Without you lot, this would not be growing as rapidly as it is. Thank you so much. Patreon.com/popularfront.